Hello. I hope you're still awake after lunch. All right. So thank you very much for asking me to come and do this talk. My background is squarely in education. I'm aware lots of you are in architecture. So I was once, a very long time ago, a school teacher, but I'm now based in an education department, so I'm an academic in education. But I've had an interest in school space that goes back quite a long way now. So I got interested in this area 20 years ago, and I've been one of the people, I keep saying to everyone, I explain what I do, and I say, there's lots of you who are architects who are interested in schools. But in schools or in education departments, there aren't that many education academics who are interested in school space. We're quite niche. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to sort of look back a little at some of the things that I've learnt over the years and then try to translate that into where I think we should go forward. And this idea of creating perfect new learning spaces. I'm going to sort of talk about what I think we know about how to do that, but it won't be telling you what to build. I think you probably guessed that. Okay, so my takeaway message, space matters. So back, say, 20 years ago when I first started reading the research, thinking about the research evidence, looking at what was out there, there is a positive correlation between the quality of the school and outcomes, but it's small. It's correlational rather than causal. It's more to do with having a really poor environment is a problem, is a negative effect. Once you get things basically okay, it's arguable then whether it makes so much difference in terms of the sort of quality and what do we mean by that. So yeah, there's a correlation out there. And I often say to people quickly, it doesn't really tell you much more than, quite a nice functioning building, has happy students, happy teachers, good staff retention, good attendance, and reasonable outcomes. Nice behaviour, okay exam results. Does that really tell us what we need to know about designing something that's really transformational or impressive or is making a difference to people's lives? So yeah, that's where the evidence was. Space matters, but it's a bit vague what we do about that. But then in more recent years, there's been a lot more research in this area, a lot more interest in this area. And we've begun to get to the sort of bottom of how it matters. And probably isn't that surprising, but it's this idea that the settings enable you to do some things quite easily. Meanwhile, they make doing other things really difficult. And by settings, I mean in the school as a whole space, individual elements of the design, the furniture, the resources you've got. So yeah, they let you do some pedagogical and social things while they hinder other things. Loads of research to show that. So what does that tell us? Well, I suppose the big thing it tells us is that this sort of complicated relationship between space and use means that there's no single perfect design for schools. You are now thinking it has taken her 20 years to arrive at that conclusion. But I think that's important. It's something to hold in mind, and it's something I think is quite helpful when you talk to people about, who are thinking about what to do about their space, that there's not a single perfect design out there, that if we could just get it here and build it, it would all be okay. So yeah, no single perfect design. So what? What we do know is to work well, you have to have that design and use sort of aligned rather than conflicting. There are various sort of frameworks to understand that. I like this one by Neil Gislason. So he's a Canadian researcher. He did 3 very detailed case studies of 3 American high schools of very different designs being used in very different ways. He adapted this framework from a model of sort of school climate, school leadership, and he points out you've got this total learning environment that's made up of these aspects, these elements. So there's what you call the ecology, so that's the physical design and your material resources, but you've also got the organisation, and this is massive in schools, of course, so you've got things like timetabling, curriculum. Then you've got the students, what the students are doing, and the staff culture. And those 4 things need to be working together. They need to be cohering, aligning, not conflicting. And when they do that, your space will work well. for whatever it is you're trying to do. And of course, you can have different spaces for different sorts of learning, different sorts of activities, but you need those different aspects to be cohering. Okay, so design and use cohering is important, therefore users are important. Therefore, what about these users? Who uses space, school space? Teachers. And yet, teachers do notice school space. Some architects think that they don't, but they do. And they do try to use it well, within the bounds of what is possible in their individual space. So, just a couple of examples of this. So within a very traditional space, in classrooms in Uruguay, Cardelino and colleagues talked to teachers about how they thought about the space, how they used the space. They also made measurements about what the children particularly could see from different points in the classroom. And the objective measures of what the children could see were very like what the teachers thought they could see. Now, this possibly isn't that surprising, but it's that point that the teachers did have quite a good sense of what were the strengths and weaknesses of those classrooms, and they were trying to use them as best they could. You see this again in more innovative, so-called innovative learning environments. So in the case of this innovative learning environment in Australia, again, the teachers were sort of grappling quite actively with how they should make better use of these very different spaces, the different facilities they had, and they say, it's a bit of a work in progress. So yeah, teachers do notice space and they try to use it. Students. So students are your other big part of most learning spaces. And they notice spaces, and they're key to how the space is used. So I've got some just quotes here from a project we did quite a lot of years ago. Gosh, goodness me, 10 years ago. These were Year 8 students in a secondary school. The school organised an experimental week of inquiry-based learning in more open school space, so the school hall actually. And this was in preparation for they were going to have a new building which would have more of this sort of open, flexible space. Here's what the kids said. Again, not particularly surprising. They noticed the difference. They were very aware of there were some things they could do in the bigger space you couldn't do in a classroom, some things that they liked better about that. They commented on how the teachers behaved differently, the relationships between teachers and students were different, that sort of thing. So yeah, student dynamics, as Gislerson says, are also key. Of course, there are lots of other users in a school space, particularly bigger schools, very complex staff. So particularly in the secondary school, you'd have had almost as many non-teaching staff as teaching staff. You'd have had your learning support, your technicians, your maintenance and cleaning staff, your canteen staff, your office staff, and of course you've got the wider community and the parents. I'm not going to have a slide for each one, you'll be pleased to know. I'm going to stick with particularly concentrating on students and teachers, but I don't want you to think that's all you find in a school. Okay, so the users matter. Therefore, they need to participate in the design of new school spaces. And whether by that we mean some of these big new builds that we've been talking about today, or whether we're just talking about a bit of a refresh of a school space. This photograph comes from some work we did with a school where they had a bit of a problematic interior. They wanted to do a bit of quite limited refurbishment, and they were just trying to think, what should we do? Okay, so they need to participate, but how? And this is a quote from a PhD thesis done by an interior designer, Bodil Boyer. And I mean, we seem to have had a lot of tools today, but she actually says, what you do with people, once you've agreed you need stakeholder involvement, what you actually do with them, especially teachers, she felt, in the design process, that is she felt still quite a gap in the literature. Okay, so how do we do this? We also need these practical participatory tools. They need to be able to travel. They need to be able to go to different places. You can't be inventing something each time for each set of school users, school communities. And yep, obviously school designs won't be universally appropriate, but the approaches to designing and the tools that we're using could be, I think. And yeah, I've certainly found a little of that. So using the same tools, the same sort of sequence of activities in two very different contexts, a UK primary school, this one in fact, where they were trying to do some refurbishment, and the same sequence of activities in a private school in Uruguay, where they were building from scratch a brand new preschool facility. We kicked off with mapping to get people to think about how the school at the moment worked. Then we did diamond ranking, so 9 images, not their school space, get the teachers and other staff to rank the images according to good learning places. So this allows people to start thinking about, what do we mean by good learning? What does that look like in a space? And talking about that link between space and learning. And it gets people away from just complaining about the space they've got, gets them thinking beyond that. Finishing off with a sort of collage of what we're going to do next. They did the same thing in Uruguay, and it worked there as well. Very different context, different participants, very different outcomes, but the same tools did work really quite well. So we need these tools that are practical, participatory, that can travel, that are accessible. And over the years, I found sort of visual spatial activities that consider existing a possible school space. They can bring people together. You can get a diversity of views, but then importantly, bring those very diverse views together and come up with a sort of coherent idea of what do we want, what can we have here? Because you can have lots of views, but you're going to have one space. So you've got to bring those ideas together. And this is what this project, Collaborative Redesign with Schools, was about. We trialed some tools across different European contexts, and the tools are all still there on the website. So for people to use, the idea was to have simple yet effective tools. Yeah, so they're practical participatory tools that can travel, that can bring people together. And my sort of reflection on those, that what works particularly well for tools that you can pick up and use, is that they're flexible but structured. And I'll explain what I mean. So here's some images from Bodil and from the chapter we've just written in Design for Education. So they need to be adjustable. If you're going to have tools that can travel, that can be appropriate for all sorts of different people, then they need to be, in different stages of the design process, they need to be very flexible. But the activities themselves have to be quite structured so they can support the interactions and carry you through from the initial diversity of ideas, some of which might be in conflict, and produce that shared understanding and a way forward. So that structuring is really important. So the diamond ranking does that, as do these other tools. And you can read more about it in Bodil and the chapter Bodil and I contributed to the book. Okay, so creating perfect learning spaces. How do we do it? Yes, partnership approaches with shared tools really can work to align your sort of local needs with school design. And by local needs, I mean what you're currently doing, but also giving you space to do some different things in the future. And that can be really powerful. Changing the physical space in education can be really, really powerful. And it can take your whole, remember that the diagram of the whole learning environment, changing the space, if you manage to do that in a way that aligns with the other aspects, can take you forward and do things differently, very powerfully. But I do think you need to do it every time for every change process, every design process. So that sort of individual stakeholder stuff, which, as I've said, doesn't have to be really, really expensive or take forever. It takes a certain amount of time, and I think that's what can be missed sometimes. And particularly if you're at the policy level, you think, we don't have to do that every time. We don't have to speak to every school. We've got a good design here, we can just implement it. And I think that's when you get problems. So this idea of you need that grassroots involvement. It doesn't have to be massively involved, lengthy or expensive, but it does need to happen. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefit that you can have with a new space and able to do things differently for the good of everybody in the space and the whole school community. Thank you. And as I am an academic, I have lots of lovely references.